Have you ever wondered what really happened inside the minds of history's most dangerous leaders when they weren't on the battlefield, but quietly reading, doubting, scheming behind closed doors? Tonight, let's slow down and step into that silent, invisible war of the mind between Hitler, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt. You're likely hearing this late at night, perhaps resting under dim light or letting the world soften around you. If so, welcome to this calm moment in time. Subscribe to our channel if you find yourself drawn to quiet history, so we can revisit stories like this again. Now, picture Europe in 1940. Hitler has won the West, Stalin plays both sides, Churchill watches alone, and Roosevelt remains distant. But behind the politics and armies was something more personal. A quiet chess game of trust, betrayal, letters, dreams, and delusions that shaped the Second World War's course. This story doesn't start with gunfire. It starts with earlobes, toasts, and misunderstandings. And it ends with millions caught in a web spun by four men who often couldn't even trust themselves. Let's begin. No one had blinked yet, but Hitler moved first, not with tanks, but with ink. What followed was perhaps the strangest pact in modern history. A paper agreement between two men who hated everything the other stood for. On the night of August 23, 1939, with Stalin's earlobes deemed acceptably Aryan and a secret clause dividing Poland between them, the Nazi-Soviet Pact was signed. It was not a treaty of trust, it was a treaty of desperation. Stalin knew he was dancing with a devil whose boots were already muddy from marching east, but he calculated that the pact would buy time to rebuild the Red Army gutted by his own. Purges. Hitler, equally desperate, saw in Stalin the key to avoiding the dreaded two-front war that had destroyed Germany once before. That pact, known publicly as a non-aggression agreement, was privately an invitation to dismember a nation. And so, just days later, Hitler invaded Poland from the west, and Stalin followed from the east. Poland vanished while the world blinked. But what no one realized was that this paper pact had triggered something deeper than war. It awakened the worst instincts in both men. Stalin toasted Hitler's health, his voice gruff with irony, but warned his circle, "It's all a game, he thinks he's outsmarted me, but I've tricked him." Hitler, meanwhile, told Goebbels that the agreement was a bitter meal choked down only because of Stalin's menace. They smiled for the world, but behind those smiles lay deep disgust and suspicion. Yet in that moment, they found something akin to admiration, not for each other's beliefs, but for each other's cruelty. Stalin had once praised Hitler's ruthless purge of the SA in 1934, calling it a deed of some skill. Hitler, watching Stalin crush Finland and purge his generals, took comfort in the Red Army's weakness. For now, they needed each other, but both knew alliances built on fear rot quickly. Even as they carved maps, both men stared into the future with knives in their hands, waiting to see which would strike first. No one had blinked yet, but Hitler moved first, not with tanks, but with ink. What followed was perhaps the strangest pact in modern history. A paper agreement between two men who hated everything the other stood for. On the night of August 23, 1939, with Stalin's earlobes deemed acceptably Aryan and a secret clause dividing Poland between them, the Nazi-Soviet Pact was signed. It was not a treaty of trust, it was a treaty of desperation. Stalin knew he was dancing with a devil whose boots were already muddy from marching east, but he calculated that the pact would buy time to rebuild the Red Army gutted by his own. Purges. Hitler, equally desperate, saw in Stalin the key to avoiding the dreaded two-front war that had destroyed Germany once before. That pact, known publicly as a non-aggression agreement, was privately an invitation to dismember a nation. And so, just days later, Hitler invaded Poland from the west, and Stalin followed from the east. Poland vanished while the world blinked. But what no one realized was that this paper pact had triggered something deeper than war. It awakened the worst instincts in both men. Stalin toasted Hitler's health, his voice gruff with irony, but warned his circle. It's all a game. He thinks he's outsmarted me, but I've tricked him. Hitler, meanwhile, told Goebbels that the agreement was a bitter meal choked down only because of Stalin's menace. They smiled for the world, but behind those smiles lay deep disgust and suspicion. Yet in that moment, they found something akin to admiration, not for each other's beliefs, but for each other's cruelty. Stalin had once praised Hitler's ruthless purge of the SA in 1934, calling it a deed of some skill. Hitler, watching Stalin crush Finland and purge his generals, took comfort in the Red Army's weakness. For now, they needed each other, but both knew alliances built on fear rot quickly. Even as they carved maps, both men stared into the future with knives in their hands, waiting to see which would strike first. Knives in hand and maps on the table, both men played the long game, but their vision of the board was clouded by pride and delusion. Hitler believed his pact with Stalin had neutralized the East, and now turned his eyes toward France and Britain, launching the Blitzkrieg with a speed that stunned the world. France collapsed in 6 weeks, and Churchill was left standing alone on an island, defiant but trembling. Stalin, watching from afar, cursed the French and the British with rising fury. How could they fall so quickly? He demanded, pacing in. Disbelief. He had expected a drawn-out war between the Western powers, a capitalist bloodletting that would keep the Soviet Union safe and buy time to expand his reach. But Hitler, efficient and mad with momentum, had delivered a shattering blow. To that fantasy, the West had crumbled, and now Stalin stood exposed, no longer protected by the chaos he had hoped for. Yet Hitler, too, was slipping into dangerous self-deception. He convinced himself that Churchill's refusal to make peace could only mean Britain was relying on something on someone. That someone, in his increasingly fevered logic, was Stalin. Hitler began to believe that the Soviet leader, while pretending to be a partner, was secretly courting the British. Every move Stalin made, every garrison placed, every letter unanswered, fed Hitler's growing conspiracy. Meanwhile, Stalin watched Hitler's victories with alarm, unsure whether he should feel admiration, envy, or fear. He tried to seize more territory in Romania, pushing the limits of their agreement, hoping to build a buffer zone without triggering Hitler's wrath. But Hitler noticed. He always noticed. He began muttering about betrayal. In his mountain retreat at Obersalzberg, Hitler let the delusions swell. The British will never surrender while Stalin stands, he said. We must strike the Soviet Union before May. It was a return to the vision that had birthed Mein Kampf, a war of extermination against Bolshevism and the Jews. For all the cold calculations and diplomatic pretenses, ideology was rising again in him like a fever, and that fever pointed east. Stalin didn't yet see it, but he would, too late. Too late would come sooner than Stalin imagined, but by then, the warnings would lie in a pile, unopened or dismissed. As Hitler's feverish plans solidified into Directive 21, the formal order to prepare for an invasion of the Soviet Union, Stalin remained locked in a world of calculated logic, so calculated, in fact, that it left no room for the irrational boldness that defined Hitler's ambition. Stalin still believed Hitler would never risk a two-front war. That to attack the Soviet Union without first defeating Britain would be suicidal. And Stalin, ever the patient gambler, believed Hitler to be just rational enough to know that. So when Churchill sent Stalin a second letter in April 1941 warning of German troop movements near the Soviet border, Stalin's mind recoiled, not in fear of Germany, but in suspicion of Britain. He told his generals that Churchill was manipulating him, trying to provoke a conflict with Hitler that would draw the Soviet Union into war prematurely. Then came one of the war's strangest moments. Hitler's deputy, Rudolf Hess, flew solo to Scotland, supposedly on a rogue peace mission. To Stalin, this was no coincidence. He connected Hess's flight with Churchill's warnings and imagined a secret backroom agreement between Britain and Germany, one where Hitler would strike Russia first while Churchill stood aside. From that moment on, Stalin saw conspiracy everywhere but in Berlin. He rejected intelligence from Soviet spies embedded in the Luftwaffe. He ignored British warnings. He brushed aside troop reports from his own generals. Hitler is not such an idiot, he insisted. Germany will not attack us alone. But the signs were too many to miss. Operation Barbarossa was only weeks away. Millions of German troops were massing at the border. German planes buzzed Soviet skies. Yet Stalin did nothing. He trusted his own theory more than he trusted the world. And while he scrutinized letters and questioned motives, Hitler played Beethoven and scribbled notes about the annihilation of Judeo-Bolshevism. One man prepared a full-scale invasion. The other prepared for a world that no longer existed. That world stitched together by theories, ego, and illusion collapsed just before dawn on June 22, 1941, when the sky over Soviet territory shattered with the roar of thousands of German aircraft. At 3:30 a.m., Operation Barbarossa began, the largest invasion in human history, with over 3 million Axis troops crashing across the Soviet border like a tidal wave. In the Kremlin, silence reigned. Stalin, having ignored every last warning, now sat frozen in disbelief. "They attacked us like gangsters," he muttered, stunned that Hitler had broken the pact without a word, without a grievance, without a demand. What followed was chaos. German tanks rolled over unprepared Soviet defenses. Entire regiments were encircled and destroyed before they could organize. Soviet generals pleaded for a full response, but Stalin hesitated, humiliated not. Only by Hitler, but by his own paralyzing misjudgment. He had refused to let his army mobilize. He had scolded his generals for provoking the Germans. Now those same generals were being arrested by the NKVD as scapegoats. General Pavlov, among others, was shot. Lenin founded our state. Stalin said bitterly, and we ate it up. He retreated into silence, barely speaking for days, while the Red Army fell back in ruins. In Berlin, Hitler exulted. "We will annihilate it now," he told Goebbels. "Right or wrong, we must win, and when we win, no one will ask how." For Hitler, the attack on the Soviet Union wasn't just strategy, it was purification. He wrote to Mussolini that his alliance with Stalin had always tormented him, always felt like a betrayal of his origins. Now he felt spiritually clean again. Barbarossa was meant to cauterize the ideological wound, to destroy communism and the Jews in one sweeping campaign of fire. But in that same moment, Stalin began to change. His silence turned to steel. He would later tell his aides, "Never put yourself in another man's mind. It'll kill you." He had tried to guess Hitler's logic. He had trusted in Hitler's limits. Now he knew better. And in the ashes of that lesson, Stalin began to prepare for the kind of war that Hitler had never anticipated. One of survival, cold rage, and vengeance that would redraw the world itself. In the smoldering silence that followed Stalin's awakening, a different war began, one no longer shaped by treaties or trust, but by endurance and retaliation. While Hitler saw his campaign as a swift, cleansing storm that would sweep communism. From the map, he failed to grasp the depth of Russian resolve once survival entered the bloodstream. Stalin, though shaken, emerged from his paralysis not with panic, but with a brutal clarity. He centralized command, demanded total sacrifice, and gave speeches that framed the conflict not as a war of politics, but of sacred homeland. Cities became fortresses. Civilians became soldiers. Fields became traps. And in this shifting landscape, the psychological war that had first flickered between leaders now engulfed entire nations. The duel of egos had become a duel of endurance. As Hitler pressed deeper into Soviet territory, convinced of inevitable victory, he overlooked the consequences of scorched earth, freezing winters, and supply lines stretched across a hostile continent. Stalin, whose own errors had invited catastrophe, now fed on humiliation like fuel. He still didn't trust his generals fully, but he had learned to listen just enough, to wait just long enough, and to strike just precisely enough to turn the tide when it came. Meanwhile, Churchill and Roosevelt began watching Stalin with cautious interest. The man they had once mistrusted became their necessary ally, and together, this uneasy trio democracy, empire, and communism would align to confront the common threat. But the scars of earlier betrayals would never quite heal. Though they shook hands in photographs, the men behind those handshakes still saw shadows in each other's eyes. Hitler had underestimated Russia's will. Stalin had overestimated Hitler's logic. And Churchill, ever the romantic pessimist, suspected that even victory would come at the cost of a fractured world. Still, as German forces pushed toward Moscow, and the snow began to fall, one thing became clear. The war of the mind, the letters, the false toasts, the ignored warnings, it was over. Now it would be decided in mud, blood, and fire. Yet behind every artillery blast and shattered village, echoes remained of a pact signed in fear, of a toast raised in deceit, and of four men who once believed they could control history with words alone. But as the echoes of broken promises faded behind the artillery smoke, a new sound stirred a cautious chorus of alliance, composed not of harmony, but of necessity. The partnership between Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt was born not out of trust, but out of overlapping fears. The Nazi war machine, once swift and precise, had begun to stretch thin as it clawed its way into the vastness of Soviet soil. Winter bit down hard, harder than Hitler imagined, and the Soviet counterattacks grew bolder, bloodier, and more organized. In London, Churchill, once wary of Stalin's purges and iron grip, now spoke of unity and fate. In Washington, Roosevelt, still bound by neutrality laws, moved chess pieces behind curtains, sending supplies, signing Lend-Lease agreements, and edging America closer to war without ever quite stepping in. Stalin, for his part, accepted the help, but never the friendship. He read every word from the West with suspicion, every aid shipment as a delayed obligation rather than a gift. In private, he still called Churchill an imperialist and Roosevelt an idealist fool. But in public, the photographs told a different story. Hands shaking across oceans, letters signed with warmth, mutual victories toasted in vodka and scotch. The world wanted heroes. The world wanted unity. But these alliances were not bridges. They were tightropes. Beneath each agreement lay a tangle of contradictions. Stalin wanted a second front in Europe immediately. Churchill wanted to bleed Germany longer in the East. Roosevelt wanted to delay commitment while preparing for everything. And while they planned conferences and exchanged pleasantries, each man scribbled private assessments of the others. Notes about temperament, ambition, weakness. They had become, in essence, temporary passengers on the same train, each convinced the others might jump off or push someone else before the journey ended. Still, the train kept moving. The Germans kept advancing. The Soviets kept resisting. And somewhere in the distance, the idea of shared victory shimmered like a mirage. Not yet solid, not yet trusted, but necessary if the world was to survive what came next. What came next was shaped, in no small part, by the man who said the least and waited the longest, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, perched across the Atlantic like a patient chess master behind a veil of calm, while Churchill thundered in speeches, and Stalin barked orders from concrete bunkers. Roosevelt remained the enigma, watching, weighing, withholding. His America was still officially neutral, but neutrality was a word wearing thin. Lend-Lease had opened a channel of steel and fuel to both Britain and the Soviet Union, and the quiet logic of Roosevelt's approach was becoming clear. Support the war without stepping fully into it until the moment was unavoidable and strategically perfect. He distrusted Stalin, but understood him. He admired Churchill, but saw through his theater. Roosevelt believed that victory required more than bullets. It needed planning, patience, and a vision that extended beyond the battlefield. In his private moments, he worried about the postwar order as much as the present. 1. If Hitler fell, what would fill the vacuum? Would Stalin become the next shadow on the map? Would Churchill cling to his fading empire, unwilling to yield to new realities? Roosevelt didn't voice these fears often, but they lived behind his eyes, calm, calculating, deeply aware of the fragility of temporary alliances. And yet, despite his caution, the world storm crept closer to American shores. German submarines patrolled the Atlantic. Japanese ambitions stirred restlessly. In the Pacific, Roosevelt knew that waiting much longer would soon be impossible. Still, he did not rush. He sent messages of encouragement to Churchill, supplies to Stalin, and prepared his people with the soft persuasion of fireside chats. He understood something the others didn't, that wars were not only won by armies, but by imagination, by shaping how millions of people saw the world and their place in it. As Churchill held the line and Stalin pushed back with fury, Roosevelt held space for a future no one fully trusted, but that everyone would soon be forced to share. In that quiet watching, he was not weak. He was waiting for history to catch up. But as Roosevelt waited for history to catch up, Stalin remembered everything, every betrayal, every hesitation, every silence from the West when it had mattered most. In the carved shadows of the Kremlin, memories were not softened by distance. They sharpened. Stalin remembered how Britain and France had watched Nazi Germany devour Czechoslovakia without lifting a finger. He remembered their failure to form an early anti-fascist alliance, their condescension in secret talks, their doubts about Soviet strength. Even now, as Churchill and Roosevelt offered weapons and praise, he could not forget that they had let Hitler rise until the beast stood at his own door. Stalin carried these memories like scars beneath his uniform, and while he fought side by side with the democracies, he never believed the war had erased the earlier sins. He took notes on the timing of shipments. He scrutinized communiques for hidden meaning. He saw delay as insult and assistance as leverage. His trust had limits, and even as the Red Army began to push the Nazis back from Moscow, he prepared for a second war, a colder one not of tanks, but of secrets and survival. In his mind, the West would eventually turn again, as it always had. Meanwhile, Churchill, for all his eloquence, privately referred to Stalin as a devil one must sup with using a long spoon. The alliance was functional, but brittle. And Roosevelt, still outside the war formally, watched the edges fray. He saw that memory, more than ideology, shaped Stalin's decisions. It was not that Stalin loved communism more than anything. It was that he hated being underestimated, dismissed, or used. Every action now, every letter, every delay, every missed promise, confirmed what he already believed. So even as the Soviet factories roared to life, even as his people dug in for the long haul of war, Stalin never stopped remembering. In a war of minds, memory was its own battlefield. And Stalin's memory, once wounded, did not forgive it planned. And while Stalin plotted in silence, Hitler dreamed louder than ever, trapped in a self-made echo chamber where his own delusions bounced back as certainty. The initial victories of Operation Barbarossa had inflated his confidence to monstrous proportions. He saw the Soviet retreat not as strategic survival, but as proof of ideological inferiority. In Hitler's mind, the war was already won. It only needed cleansing fire to finish it. He believed that the Slavic peoples would crumble, that the winter would bend to his will, that his soldiers exhausted and frostbitten were instruments of destiny, not men with limits. Each Soviet counterattack was dismissed as desperation. Each logistical setback was a minor detail beneath the grandeur of a 1,000-year Reich. Even his generals, increasingly wary of the Eastern Front's blood-slicked snow, dared not challenge him. He paced through his mountain retreat, muttering lines from Wagner, rereading his own speeches, seeking confirmation in shadows. He remained convinced that Churchill persisted only because of Soviet resistance, and that once Moscow fell, Britain would finally submit. He could not grasp the resilience he had awakened in his enemies, nor the slow encirclement beginning to form around him. His illusion, by now, was no longer strategy, it was sanctuary. He refused to see the Red Army adapting, growing, absorbing Western aid, and turning defeat into delay, then into resistance, then into momentum. He ignored intelligence, dismissed reports of Soviet manufacturing recovery, and belittled Roosevelt's growing involvement. Hitler still saw the world through the lens of 1939, when he made the first move, and everyone blinked. But 1942 was not 1939. The pieces had shifted. The alliances had hardened. The fire he had lit in Russia was beginning to burn backwards. Yet he remained, in his own mind, the chosen architect of fate, unable to understand that the foundation beneath him was already cracking. For him, the war had never truly left the realm of ideology and ideologues. Once blinded by belief, rarely see the collapse until they are buried in it. Buried beneath Hitler's illusions, the war shifted westward again, and at its fulcrum stood Winston Churchill shouldering a crumbling empire, managing a restless ally in Stalin, and still waiting for Roosevelt to fully commit. The British Prime Minister understood better than most that the war was no longer just a matter of bullets and orders. It was a test of relationships, narratives, and timing. Churchill had mastered the art of appearing confident, even when rational. Books thinned and bombs cratered his capital. He spoke in thunderous tones to his people, but whispered carefully to his allies, knowing that every misstep could unravel the fragile scaffolding holding their coalition together. With Hitler fixated on the East, Churchill tried to stretch the fight without overstretching his nation. He promised Stalin support, but stalled on a second front. He reassured Roosevelt, but pushed harder than the American public was ready to. Except, behind the scenes, his notes were filled with compromise and contradiction. To Stalin, he was a loyal partner. To Roosevelt, a practical realist. To his own people, a lion in the storm. But privately, Churchill agonized. He feared that delaying too long would sour Soviet trust, that opening a front too soon would risk another Dunkirk. He knew Stalin watched every delay with suspicion, and that Roosevelt, ever cautious, calculated every move in months, not weeks. Churchill's greatest strength, his rhetorical brilliance, could only go so far in the face of mounting pressure from both allies and enemies. He navigated each summit, each communiqué, like a tightrope walker above a pit of old empires and rising fears. And yet, through charm, force, and the sheer momentum of his belief in Britain's endurance, he held the balance. For now. But he knew the clock was ticking. He could hear it in Stalin's terse replies, see it in Roosevelt's reserved expressions, and feel it in every new telegram from the front. Churchill wasn't just fighting Hitler anymore. He was holding together a coalition stitched with threadbare trust and the fraying belief that they were all, despite everything, on the same side. And while Churchill tiptoed across his diplomatic tightrope, the weight beneath him was growing heavier ghosts of empire, pressing through every decision, every delay. Britain, once the globe's unrivaled master, now fought not just for survival against fascism, but for relevance in a world rapidly redrawn by tanks, treaties, and industrial might beyond its own dwindling shores. Churchill understood this more deeply than he let on. He spoke often of freedom, of civilization standing firm, but in quieter corridors, he clung to imperial maps still drenched in red. India strained beneath the war burden. Colonies contributed soldiers and resources without promise of future independence, and behind each rousing speech lay the quiet question: could Britain remain an empire in the world that would follow this war? Roosevelt didn't think so. Privately, he found Britain's hold over its colonies an outdated relic, even as he supported its wartime survival. Stalin, by contrast, scoffed at the entire British concept of empire, seeing it as the dying gasp of capitalist hypocrisy. Yet Churchill stood firm not just for Britain's wartime role, but for its post-war position. Every demand from Stalin for a second front, every negotiation with Roosevelt, carried the hidden weight of preserving Britain's seat at the table. The Atlantic Charter, though noble in language, threatened to unravel the imperial system he cherished. Roosevelt's talk of self-determination made Churchill wince, not because he feared freedom, but because he feared chaos, rebellion, the loss of global identity. Yet even he knew the world was changing. American factories now produced more than Britain and Germany combined. Soviet soldiers now died in numbers that dwarfed British sacrifice. The empire was still flying its flags, but history was already shifting its spotlight. Churchill fought with words and will, but even he began to feel it, that the war he was helping win might also write the obituary of the very empire he fought to defend. In victory, something would still be lost. He knew it, but he marched forward anyway, shoulders squared, cigar lit, bluffing the future with all the elegance he had left. But while Churchill bluffed the future with rhetoric and stubborn elegance, Stalin prepared his reply, not with speeches but with silence, steel, and numbers carved in blood. The Soviet war machine, once paralyzed by shock and purges, had begun to mutate into something monstrous and unrelenting, shaped by bitter winters, urban ruins, and the collective trauma of betrayal. This was Stalin's quiet revenge, not the theatrical defiance of Churchill or the principled calculations of Roosevelt, but the grinding, tireless flood of manpower and production that turned the tide against Hitler. By 1943, the Soviet Union was not just defending it, was devouring. At Stalingrad, German hopes froze alongside their soldiers, and from that frozen graveyard, Stalin rebuilt not only his army, but his image. To the West, he was now indispensable, a man who had absorbed a Nazi onslaught and thrown it back. But Stalin remembered everything. The delay of the Second Front, the patronizing tone in Allied messages, the assumption that he would break. He hadn't forgotten 1939, nor Churchill's earlier contempt, nor Roosevelt's hesitant generosity. So he smiled in photographs, raised glasses at summits, and plotted beneath the surface. The Red Army's advance through Eastern Europe became more than a liberation. It was a reclamation of dignity, security, and influence. Each town retaken, each line pushed west, carried the echo of a promise Stalin had made to himself when Hitler betrayed him. Never again would Russia be unprepared, underestimated, or surrounded by uncertain allies. As Western leaders debated strategies, Stalin drew new borders in his mind. While Allied planes dropped leaflets, he dropped ideologies, installing loyalists, reshaping regions before negotiations even began. His revenge was patient, bureaucratic, and vast rewriting maps before pens ever met treaties. He would never again need to beg for time. Now he controlled it. And as the West toasted Soviet victories, Stalin drank to something else entirely, the slow, inevitable expansion of his shadow across the war-torn spine of Europe. And so, as Stalin's shadow deepened across Eastern Europe, the moment finally arrived when all three warlords, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, stood together in the same room, breathing the same wary air. It was November 1943, and the city was Teheran, a neutral meeting ground ringed with bodyguards, espionage, and unspoken judgments. On the surface, the Teheran Conference was about unity, planning the final blows against Hitler, coordinating offensives, deciding on post-war reconstruction. But beneath the handshakes and flashes of press cameras, tension coiled tight like a spring. Stalin sat comfortably now, confident in Soviet strength, amused by the unease of his allies. Churchill, once the elder statesman of defiance, felt increasingly sidelined, outpaced by Stalin's dominance and Roosevelt's subtle maneuvers. And Roosevelt, frail but sharp, played mediator with a half-smile and long glances, sensing that these meetings weren't just about winning the war, they were about shaping the world after it. The Soviets wanted a second front immediately. The British hesitated, cautious of another bloodbath like Gallipoli. The Americans promised commitment, but delayed on specifics. And through it all, Stalin observed, remembering every previous slight, extracting quiet concessions. He teased Churchill, flattered Roosevelt, and demanded Polish borders shift westward a seed for future conflict buried in diplomatic language. The Teheran air was thick not with victory, but with veiled suspicion. At night, guards doubled their shifts. Spies roamed freely in Persian robes. Even the table settings were arguments in symbolism. Roosevelt deliberately avoided Churchill's room, choosing to be seen walking side by side with Stalin. A gesture meant to balance power, but which Churchill noted with a bitter flick of the eyes. These were not friends, they were survivors. And even as they plotted the destruction of Nazi Germany, each man thought in parallel. What happens after? Who holds what? Who decides the story when the blood stops? The war they were planning to win had not yet ended, but the next war of influence, silence, and shadows was already unfolding beneath the polished floors of Tehran. When the polished floors of Tehran emptied and the leaders returned to their respective citadels of war, the silence between them was filled not with comfort, but with correspondence letters laced in formality, strategy, and suspicion. The triumvirate had smiled for the cameras, but now their pens resumed the cautious work of diplomacy disguised as friendship. Stalin wrote first, thanking Roosevelt for his warmth and for understanding the Soviet position. But even his praise carried an undertone of reminder that the Red Army was bleeding every day, that promises of a second front must become action, and that the Soviets were no longer beggars but equals. Churchill responded in kind, verbose and rich with historical flourishes. But behind every word was his growing anxiety that Britain's place in the post-war order was shrinking between the weight of Stalin's armies and Roosevelt's vision. Roosevelt, in turn, wrote carefully measured replies, veiling his deeper concerns beneath charm. He wanted unity, yes, but also influence, leverage, balance. These were not ordinary letters. They were psychological probes, each sentence shaped to extract without exposing, to agree without conceding. Stalin had his aides study every word, searching for signs of delay or duplicity. Churchill rewrote drafts endlessly, measuring tone against pride. Roosevelt's letters were quiet traps of diplomacy, never confrontational, but never fully committed. As the Allies inched closer to victory, their communications grew longer, more tangled, filled with repetition, reassurance, and quiet corrections. Behind closed doors, their advisors argued over word choices. Every soon meant not yet. Every joint meant conditional. Every trust meant watch carefully. They were allies, yes, but only because their enemies had not yet been defeated. And with each passing month, the letters began to carry something. Heavier than ink, the weight of a world being shaped by men who no longer believed the others would keep their promises once the war was done. They weren't writing to coordinate anymore. They were writing to prepare for peace, yes, but not necessarily together. And while the letters passed between capitals like chess pieces wrapped in politeness, one player at the board began to fade not in power, but in flesh. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the architect of quiet diplomacy and the softest spoken of the warlords, was dying. His aides whispered about his weight loss, the grayness beneath his eyes, the long pauses during briefings. But Roosevelt, ever the strategist, kept his decline hidden behind composed expressions and careful sentences. He had built his influence not through volume, but through stillness, through the art of listening longer than others spoke. And now, even as his breath shortened, he leaned further into vision. He dreamed not of flags planted in victory, but of institutions. A new United Nations, a world structured to avoid this again. While Stalin prepared to harden his grip and Churchill longed for the empire's heartbeat to return, Roosevelt thought beyond borders. He didn't believe in permanent alliances. He believed in systems that might outlive the passions of men. But time was closing in. At Yalta in early 1945, when the Big Three met again, Roosevelt looked tired, slumped in his chair beside the sharp-eyed Stalin and the ever-booming Churchill. Photographs show him smiling faintly, but observers saw the truth. Behind the soft voice was a man drained of years. Still, he pushed through the meetings, negotiating Poland's fate, Soviet, entry into the war against Japan, and the basic architecture of the post-war world. But something had shifted. Roosevelt's hopeful optimism met the granite realism of Stalin's intentions and Churchill's imperial nostalgia. The three men agreed to terms, but not to trust. Within 2 months of that historic gathering, Roosevelt was gone dead of a cerebral hemorrhage on April 12, 1945. He never saw Hitler's suicide, nor the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima. And yet, his fingerprints lingered on everything that followed. His death was not loud. It was not theatrical. It was the quiet withdrawal of the only warlord who had planned for peace not as a pause, but as a blueprint. And with his exit, the triangle tilt and the balance shifted forever. The moment Roosevelt's chair fell empty, Stalin moved to fill the space, not with sorrow, but with structure. There was no pause, no silence of grief, only the cold, efficient recalibration of power. Roosevelt had been the balancer, the cautious dreamer between Churchill's booming past and Stalin's advancing future. Without him, the conversations between victors became strained, brittle, and sharp-edged. Stalin no longer needed to wear the mask of modesty. He had already positioned Soviet troops deep into Eastern Europe, and those boots on the ground now spoke louder than any telegram or treaty. Poland, the question that had haunted every conference, became a fact on the ground. Communist governments, cloaked in nationalism, began to rise wherever the Red Army lingered. Stalin didn't announce these moves, he simply made them. Churchill protested, of course, in speeches layered with thunder and indignation. He warned of iron curtains and broken promises, but his voice no longer echoed with the certainty it once had. Britain was exhausted, its empire bleeding, and Stalin knew it. In Washington, Truman had taken office blunt where Roosevelt had been subtle, suspicious where his predecessor had been patient. But Truman was new to this game, still gathering his footing, and Stalin seized the moment. He wrapped influence in liberation, control in security, and expansion in ideology. Each Soviet occupation was justified as protection from future German aggression, but beneath that logic lay a simple truth. Stalin trusted borders drawn by tanks more than by treaties. The Western allies watched, disoriented by the speed and silence of his moves. The war was not yet over, but the shape of post-war. Europe was already being drawn, not in pencil, but in iron rails and red flags. Stalin had survived Hitler, outlasted Roosevelt, and now stood as the unchallenged master of a new empire, not the global revolution he once imagined, but a wide, hardened sphere where trust was irrelevant and power was permanent. Where the West debated, Stalin decided. Where others paused, he advanced. The age of Roosevelt's diplomacy had ended. The age of Stalin's shadow had begun. But while Stalin built his empire in silence, and Truman began learning the language of confrontation, Churchill turned to his oldest weapon memory. The war was not yet finished, but in Churchill's mind, the true battle had shifted from land to legacy. He no longer saw himself as just a prime minister, but as a witness, a guardian of what had been fought for, and a prophet of what might be lost. He sensed the tide turning not just in Europe, but in the narrative. Stalin was not retreating from conquered territories, and Roosevelt, the only Western leader who had truly understood the rhythm of Stalin's mind, was gone. Churchill's speeches became elegies in advance. In private, he feared Britain had become a junior partner in a story it once authored, but he refused to fade quietly. In March 1946, from a modest stage in Fulton, Missouri, he stood beside Truman and delivered a speech that cracked like thunder across the post-war calm. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. The phrase was not just metaphor, it was warning, indictment, and confession all at once. Churchill wasn't just addressing Stalin, he was addressing history, pleading not to forget the slippery path from alliance to silence. He knew he was no longer in command. Britain was financially crippled, its colonies agitating for freedom, and America had emerged as the new pillar of the West. Yet Churchill clung to the stage, not to preserve power, but to preserve perspective. He invoked not just victory, but vigilance. Not just what they had won, but what they were already losing: unity, transparency, a shared dream of peace. He didn't hate Stalin, he feared him, not for what he had done, but for how easily others might forget what it had taken to stop him. In that speech, Churchill was not trying to start a new war. He was trying to stop the next one from being invisible. Memory was his final battlefield. And as the applause rose around him, Churchill knew he wasn't just fighting Stalin's influence, he was fighting against forgetfulness itself. And while Churchill thundered warnings into history's quiet corners, It was Harry S. Truman, unassuming, plain-spoken, often underestimated, who now held the torch of Western resolve. He had not been part of the original triangle, not shaped by the early war duels or the long nights at Teheran, but history had chosen him nonetheless. Where Roosevelt had whispered through complexity and Churchill had thundered through tradition, Truman spoke plainly. And when Stalin tested him first with silence, then with movement, Truman responded not with trust, but with a firm, sharp turn toward containment. He saw what Churchill feared, that Stalin's promises at Yalta had become borders in concrete, that Eastern Europe was not rebuilding, but being reshaped into something new and closed. Truman had inherited more than a war's end. He had inherited a global crossroads. The atomic bomb, dropped months after Roosevelt's death, had altered not just warfare, but diplomacy. Stalin, having learned of the weapon only after its use, burned with resentment, not just at the technology, but at the exclusion. Trust, always fragile, cracked completely. Truman understood this, and instead of attempting Roosevelt's dance of balance, he adopted a doctrine of lines. When Greece and Turkey threatened to fall under Soviet influence, Truman went to Congress and declared that the United States would support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation. It was not just policy, it was declaration. The Truman Doctrine was the first brick in a wall meant to halt Stalin's silent march. From that moment, aid was not just economic, it was ideological. Stalin, watching from Moscow, understood the shift. The soft tones of Roosevelt were gone. The tentative patience of wartime alliance was finished. Now the world was dividing not through gunfire, but through funding, alliances, and narratives. NATO would soon follow, as would the Marshall Plan. Truman, once the accidental president, had drawn the line that others would follow for decades. He didn't seek glory, nor deliver stirring poetry, but he made decisions with finality. In the absence of trust, he chose boundaries. In the vacuum Roosevelt left behind, Truman built walls. But if Truman built walls, Stalin filled the space behind them with silence, fear, and control so absolute it became almost invisible. The post-war world was no longer a battlefield of bullets. It was a theater of postures, where every movement carried symbolic weight, and Stalin performed his role with chilling precision. Behind the Iron Curtain he had so carefully drawn, regimes rose that echoed his voice. Newspapers mirrored his phrases, and schoolchildren learned a history already scrubbed clean of complexity. Stalin no longer needed to justify his expansion. He simply enforced it. Secret police in Warsaw, Bucharest, and Prague operated not on local authority, but on Moscow's breath. Leaders who deviated even slightly from Stalin's line vanished, replaced by men whose loyalty outweighed their intellect. He allowed small parliaments and mock elections, but their outcomes were predetermined long before ballots touched hands. This was Stalin's final stage, not the chaos of revolution or the improvisation of wartime survival, but the cold permanence of post-victory architecture. He had transformed himself from a suspicious revolutionary into a sovereign of silence, and every corridor of power now carried his footprint. Yet, despite this iron grip, Stalin remained haunted by betrayal, by the memory of Hitler's lies, by the possibility that the West still plotted quietly beyond his vision. So he tightened further. He isolated Soviet scientists, fearing intellectual contamination. He distrusted even his most loyal commanders. He read reports not to learn, but to confirm what he already believed. Paranoia was no longer a flaw, it was policy. And beneath the calm of post-war diplomacy, another storm was forming. The world had split, not by accident, but by design, drawn with the steady, unshaking hand of a man who never forgot who had hesitated, who had delayed, who had doubted. Stalin had won the psychological war that began with Hitler, endured Roosevelt. and outlasted Churchill. But in winning, he had frozen the world. And in the frost that followed, nothing bloomed, only boundaries. The stage was his, but the curtain never fell. It simply calcified. And so the world stood frozen, not in peace, not in war, but in a suspended state of watchfulness, where every gesture became a message, every silence a signal. The division that Stalin had drawn with iron was now being reinforced by Western, concrete, as nations picked sides not through consensus, but through necessity. In Eastern Europe, barbed wire multiplied faster than debate, and radio towers beamed only state-approved truths. In the West, political rhetoric hardened, aid flowed westward, and military alliances began to coalesce into something permanent. The Berlin blockade of 1948 was the first visible crack, revealing just how quickly collaboration had curdled into containment. When Stalin attempted to suffocate the western sectors of Berlin, it was not just an act of aggression, it was a test probing the West's willingness to resist by air, supply, and resolve. Truman answered not with bombs, but with biscuits and coal, as American and British aircraft turned the Berlin skies into a lifeline. The airlift succeeded, but the division had become undeniable. Stalin withdrew the blockade in silence, but the message had been sent. There would be no reunification, no shared rebuilding, no healing. The world had chosen its directions. NATO rose in the West, a military spine of democracies linked by mutual fear and ideology. In response, Stalin solidified his grasp on the East, laying the foundation for the Warsaw Pact that would follow. But even beyond Europe, the seeds of division scattered. In Asia, civil wars became proxy theaters. In Africa and Latin America, revolutions soon took on ideological colors. What began as a psychological duel between Form and Hitler, Stalin, Churchill, Roosevelt, was now the blueprint for a global polarity. And though two of those men were gone, their shadows remained, etched into policies, speeches, and school books. The Cold War was not born of battle alone. It was born of mistrust, ambition, fear, and memory. Stalin had solidified his control, but the rest of the world had learned his language, suspicion. And in that unspoken dialect, the next half-century would unfold quietly, tensely, irrevocably. Irrevocable though it seemed, Winston Churchill still believed that words could shift the axis of fate, or at least slow its spin. Though no longer in office, he had not vanished. He lingered as an elder statesman, a voice that carried both gravitas and nostalgia. By the early 1950s, the Cold War's contours had hardened, but Churchill was not content to watch from the sidelines. He saw in Stalin's firm grip and Truman's unwavering doctrine a new danger not of immediate war, but of permanent estrangement, of a world resigned to suspicion. In 1953, as tensions simmered, Churchill delivered what would become his last great international plea, not a roar, but a measured warning. He called for negotiation, for dialogue, for the unfolding of the scroll of the future through diplomacy rather than destruction. It was not a call to forgive, nor to forget. It was a call to step back from the ledge. He feared that the longer the walls remained, the more normalized they would become, until generations grew up thinking division was the natural state of things. He warned of a world where iron curtains were inherited rather than constructed. Yet even as he spoke, events were moving beyond oratory. Stalin, old and increasingly paranoid, had grown distant from diplomacy, while Truman had left office, replaced by Eisenhower, who favored strength over subtlety. Churchill's voice, once the thunder that rallied nations, was now an echo in chambers filled with newer calculations. But it wasn't bitterness that filled him. It was weariness. He had seen too many alliances fray, too many enemies become necessities. He didn't believe the Cold War was inevitable. He believed it had been allowed, shaped by fear and silence more than design. And so his last warning was not about missiles or armies. It was about memory. That the world not forget how quickly friends had become foes, and how fragile the peace between wars truly was. It was his final attempt to bend history back toward clarity before it hardened into habit. But while Churchill's voice faded into reflective warnings, the man who had spent decades reshaping Europe through silence and suspicion came to his final hour not with triumph, but with isolation. Joseph Stalin, the unflinching architect of purges and borders, died on March 5, 1953, slumped on a couch in his dacha, surrounded not by comrades, but by fearful subordinates, too frightened to enter his room without permission. For nearly a day, they waited outside his door as he lay semi-conscious, paralyzed by a stroke and drowning in the same paranoia he had cultivated in everyone else. It was a fitting end for a man who had trusted no one, and in return, found no one willing to save him. His death was not mourned with tears of warmth, but with the breathless uncertainty of a nation unsure whether to grieve or exhale. In the West, his passing was met with cautious calculation. Would the machine he built continue? Would the cold war accelerate or soften? And within his own orbit, the power vacuum rippled like a tremor beneath frozen ground. There were no heirs with vision, only survivors of his long shadow. Beria, Khrushchev, Malenkov, they emerged, blinking into the sunlight, unsure of how to govern without his towering silence defining the air. But Stalin's death did not end the Cold War. It merely transferred its weight. His methods, his borders, his worldview, they remained embedded in the machinery of the Soviet state. And more than that, in the minds of those who had lived under his gaze, Stalin had not just ruled. He had rewritten the language of power. He had shown the world how suspicion could become governance, how fear could be institutionalized, how war could be waged without declarations. His absence was not a relief, it was a challenge. Because the war of the mind he once fought with Hitler, and Churchill, then Roosevelt, had outlived all of them. And as the bells tolled in Moscow, somewhere deep in the foundations of both, East and West, the world realized Stalin was gone, but his architecture of doubt was still standing. And so, with Stalin gone, but his architecture intact, the world entered a strange new season. Not war, not quite peace, but something in between. A long twilight of unease that came to be known as the Cold War. This peace was not marked by celebration or treaties, but by shadows stretching across continents. Nations rebuilt, but did so under watchful eyes. Children grew up learning new enemies in their textbooks, while radios hummed with coded truths and rehearsed certainties. In the Soviet bloc, life marched on under different names, but familiar. Rule's loyalty was still currency, dissent still treason. In the West, the language of freedom became inseparable from the language of containment. Armies didn't clash across battlefields. They prepared endlessly in silence. The world became a chessboard of gestures, nuclear drills, satellite launches, summit meetings held under the glassy smiles of men who shook hands but never let go of their briefcases. The dream of post-war unity, once whispered between Roosevelt and Churchill, had evaporated into hardened policies and mutual suspicion. The Marshall Plan had revived Western Europe, but the price was alignment. In Eastern Europe, reconstruction was tied to ideological loyalty. The globe, once splintered by invasion, was now bisected by influence. Stalin had left behind more than memories. He left borders, systems, and a vocabulary of mistrust. Even Khrushchev, who would soon denounce Stalin's brutality in a secret speech, could not dismantle the legacy entirely. The Gulag still stood. The KGB still listened. NATO expanded. The Warsaw Pact followed. Espionage replaced diplomacy. Fear replaced diplomacy. Ideals became arsenals. And the war of the mind that had begun between four men once allies, once enemies, now passed to nations, leaders, and generations raised in the fallout of their decisions. The cold peace was not calm, it was controlled. A held breath, never fully exhaled. And though Stalin had died, and Hitler before him, the structures they forged remained, passed down not through inheritance, but through inertia. The world had not found peace. It had learned how to live without it. Living without peace became a global ritual, and over time, the strange stillness of the Cold War began to feel ordinary, embedded in architecture, in language, in the very pacing of daily life. School children in America practiced duck and cover, drills beneath their desks, while their counterparts in Moscow studied maps drawn with invisible lines. Television sets glowed with propaganda that no longer needed to shout. The quiet repetition of fear did the work. Diplomats exchanged words, wrapped in steel, and summits were no longer places of resolution, but carefully choreographed performances of civility over a chasm of mutual doubt. Berlin stood as the symbol of it all divided, not just by walls of concrete, but by ideologies hardened into habit. What had started as temporary divisions became generational legacies. Sons of soldiers grew up to become generals in a war that no one wanted to ignite, but no one dared to end. The original architects Hitler, Stalin, Churchill, Roosevelt had long since left the stage, their portraits fading, their names reduced to lessons and warnings. And yet, their choices echoed. Their psychological battles, once fought in silence and telegrams, had become the backdrop to life itself. The war of the mind had metastasized into systems' nuclear arsenals, surveillance states, proxy wars, and a world map colored not by nations, but by alignments. Even as the decades passed, even as the Soviet Union trembled toward collapse and new flags were sewn from old fabric, the habits remained. Suspicion, posture, the theater of diplomacy shadowed by missiles waiting in silence. And though the wall would one day fall and the curtains be drawn back, the deeper architecture, the part built of fear and ego, was harder to dismantle. The Cold War ended, but its grammar endured, shaping how nations viewed one another, how alliances formed, how enemies were imagined. It was never just about land or ideology. It was about memory. And memory, once etched into history with the precision of warlords and the silence of treaties, remains long after the speeches end. It lives in the quiet spaces between nations and the shadows that remain. And in those shadows that remain, we are left to wonder, not just what the warlords built, but what they left behind in all of us. The speeches have quieted, the borders redrawn, and yet the fear they planted still shapes how leaders look at one another across tables, how nations hesitate before trusting, how history whispers warnings, not through noise, but through silence. What began as a war of egos became a world divided by expectation, by memory, by the simple inability to forget. And perhaps that is the lesson, that the greatest wars are not fought in trenches or cities, but in minds, between caution and ambition, between logic and pride, between the past and the future. These four men, flawed, brilliant, dangerous, left their fingerprints on a century, but the echoes they created still shape the world we inherit today. Thank you for walking slowly through this quiet history with us. Subscribe to our channel so we can meet again next time. And if you're still listening, know that other stories just as strange, just as forgotten, are also waiting for you. Until then, rest easy. The war is over, but the lessons continue.